Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy for your consumption. And then, when you go into instances where people start to throw some of the somewhat less than accurate news rhetoric back at you, you have facts to back them up. And our first guest this week, as we have a terrific program, is Hans von Spakovsky. He is the Senior Legal Fellow with the Heritage Foundation, manager of their election law reform initiative. And Hans, welcome back to the program. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely wonderful. You have a great piece on the Facebook story, and there's so much about Facebook and this Cambridge data company and the Trump campaign and Steve Bannon. But I think lost in this for most consumers is the fact that this was something that the Obama campaign was lauded for their ability to mine this data and then put it to use so that they could get out the vote, as it were. But now your point is that may have violated election law. Explain.
Well, in fact, Carol Davidson, who apparently was the social media director for the Obama campaign 2012, recently said that not only did they mine all this data from Facebook, but that Facebook actually came to their offices and said, we don't normally allow this data out. We don't allow people to get this data, but we're going to let you have it because we favor your candidate. Now, the problem with that is that the data that they were getting, which was basically data on all the Facebook users, that's very valuable data. And the Obama campaign used it not only for fundraising, but to target people they thought would vote for them.
Oh, yeah.
And that potentially is a violation of the ban on corporate contributions. Corporations for more than 100 years have been banned from making contributions to federal candidates. And that means they can't, not only can they not give them money, but they can't give them in-kind contributions. They can't give them free office space. They can't give them free cars to use in their campaigns. And that includes they can't give them this kind of valuable data. It's really just a more sophisticated version of the kind of mailing lists that direct mail marketers have.
Well, and I'm sure Facebook does. We've covered this story. There's some great pieces on when something on the internet is free, you're the product, and that is sort of the user's agreement you sign. And so many folks who don't read, they just click accept and download whatever software or app they're using, have agreed to allow this stuff out. So privacy issues notwithstanding, what kind of in-kind contribution are we talking about that this kind of data would have cost, let's say, a Pepsi-Cola bottling company if they wanted this data so that they knew who to target Mountain Dew versus Dr. Pepper to?
Well, we actually have a very good estimate of that because let's go back to the supposed scandal, which really isn't a scandal that's filling the news, and that is the fact that the Trump campaign hired a company called Cambridge Analytica to also help it target voters. Well, Cambridge Analytica also got this kind of data from Facebook, and they paid, and you can see this on the campaign finance disclosure reports that the Trump campaign filed with the FEC. They literally paid Cambridge Analytica hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this.
So we even have a dollar figure.
I didn't total it all up when I looked at the reports, but we're talking literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. The difference is that Facebook actually went to Cambridge Analytica, this company, when they found out they had the data and said, hey, you're not supposed to have this data. This breaks our rules. We want you to destroy the data. And the Trump campaign cannot be in any way accused of any wrongdoing because they hired this company. They paid for the services they got. They reported it properly to the FEC. If there's some controversy between Cambridge Analytica and Facebook over whether they, were entitled to have access to the data or not, that's their problem. That's not something that the Trump campaign is responsible for. So on the one hand, you have the Trump campaign actually complying fully with federal campaign finance laws, and you have the Obama campaign on the other side potentially not having complied with federal campaign finance laws and having gotten something for free that the Trump campaign had to pay for.
Something very valuable, apparently, for free in kind. Hans, now, I've worked on many campaigns as volunteer. I've done phone banking. I've done door knocking. I've stuffed envelopes. And the lists that campaigns have range from incredibly detailed to sometimes, often, as we found out with what was the excuse regarding Ed Gillespie's gubernatorial campaign, senatorial campaign, is they had such an old data list that it didn't include people who only had cell phones. So, I mean, I've seen it run the gamut of good to bad. But this sort of information is in and of itself not untoward. Campaigns, it's almost their lifeblood, whether they get it from the State Board of Elections or their own door-knocking lists. It ranges. But this information is really what drives most campaigns, isn't it?
Oh, it certainly is, because, again, it's these campaigns drive two things. Fundraising, because you want to find the individuals who will be giving you, who are willing to give you money,
right,
so that you can pay for the campaign. But second, it's your way of identifying potential voters. So that's why the folks who do direct mail marketing, they make a lot of money.
Oh yeah,
selling those services and selling this kind of data to campaigns.
And you mentioned the direct mail, and you want to talk about a return on investment. So if, let's say, a constant contact email costs 10 cents, and you have to send 1,000 of them out to get a $50 contribution, that's not a very good return on investment. So being able to target those to more likely campaign contributors, especially as Bernie Sanders likes to talk, everybody gave me less than $20 or whatever it may be. Those are important numbers to know, because it's a manpower. You only have a limited amount of time, but each dollar has to go very far in these campaigns.
Yeah, and that's why the Facebook data is so valuable, and everyone should understand. You and I, we use Facebook for free, but the reason Facebook has made so much money, and the way they're able to support themselves, is that when they sell ads to advertisers, they go to the advertisers and they say, "Look, we can target those ads to individual Facebook users because we can tell how they think by all of the very personal information they put on their Facebook pages."
Well, and it's not unheard of. I mean, in this industry, now, of course, we're a nonprofit, but we're carried on for-profit radio stations as part of their public affairs commitment. Those radio stations pay the Nielsen company to do ratings, and then those ratings are used by their marketing departments to say, this radio station attracts these types of listeners in these types of places. Do you want to put your automobile dealership or beverage distributor or dry cleaner out in front of them for the best return on that investment? It's narrow casting, I guess, is what it would most likely be called now, as opposed to just sending your message out there and hoping it catches as many people as you can.
Right. Look, that's very true. So, look, Congress right now, as you know, wants to have hearings. They want to talk to the head of Facebook, because their concern that they're saying is over the privacy of Facebook users. But I think they're kind of missing the point of the fact that there may have actually been a violation of federal campaign finance law, certainly by the Obama campaign, and that's something that ought to be investigated. Not only should Congress do that, but if there was an actual violation of the law, the Federal Election Commission and the U.S. Justice Department ought to consider opening up investigations.
Well, Hans, I know that the federal government has certainly shown great zeal in pursuing Obama administration staffers who have patently broken the law in the past, and so I'm glad
you're right.
April Fools. So we're a week late for April Fools. So I don't know if either you or I are holding our breath, but this is a seminal problem. Is this? when you talk about election reform, it's not just about narrowcasting or data mining or anything else. It's breaking laws that we've already put in the books. And I love listening to politicians say, we ought to have a law that prevents X from happening. Meanwhile, there are laws that prevent X from happening that people have been ignoring. And just enforce the laws we have, and we might have a better system than the one that you love to run around and point at and say how broken it is. Is that a fair thing to say?
Oh, it sure is, and I'll give you a specific example in Virginia, and that is, look, in 2016, you may recall, the Public Interest Legal Foundation put out a report over the 5,500 non-citizens who had been removed from voter rolls in the state of Virginia after election officials, mostly by accident, discovered that they were non-citizens. That was not, however, before they'd cast around 7,500 ballots. I'm not aware of a single Commonwealth attorney in any county in the entire state who has asked for that data, for the names of those voters and non-citizens, so that they can investigate and possibly prosecute those non-citizens for having illegally registered and voted. Not a single district attorney anywhere in the state.
I know there was one Commonwealth's attorney that did that. Unfortunately, now he's a member of Congress, so Tom Garrett can't come back and re-prosecute that. But yeah, he was a really one of the rare instances where this was the case. And I guess what it comes down to is a campaign, an ad campaign almost of this direct democracy. Everybody should have a right to vote. Why don't we set up polling places in The Hague as well, since it's so important to everyone else who our presidents are for our federal elections? It seems like that the conservatives don't want to be seen as keeping people from voting. I hear phrases like poll tax. One more time, I'm going to yak. And the left certainly doesn't, because it seems to benefit them, because those on the fringes are the ones who are going to be getting the benefits of the progressive programs.
Unfortunately, I think you're right, and that's why, for example, remember when Terry McAuliffe was the governor, he vetoed something like 8 different bills that Republicans in the state legislature had passed that were intended to clean up our voter rolls, to take non-citizens off the voter rolls. I mean, all kinds of things like that. Every single one of them he vetoed. It's pretty clear. McAuliffe wants people who are ineligible voting because he obviously thought it would benefit his political party.
Well, and you look at his restoration of voting rights without cracking open a single dossier on any of these folks. Just said, yeah, all these folks are eligible by time served. All right, give them back. And some of them were back in prison. Some of them were on the FBI's most wanted list because they had gone on the lam. I mean, it was amazing to think of somebody who would just do this without any sort of consideration.
Yeah, it's frustrating, isn't it?
Hans von Spakovsky is a senior legal fellow with the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org. He's also their manager of election law reform initiative. I want to spend a little bit of time on the fanciful, Hans. And we've talked about Facebook and what they may have done in violation of the law, but it's something we've been grappling with, for probably 20 years, is how to more effectively manage our elections so that they're open and fair and above board. And I'm sometimes struck by what Winston Churchill said about the American government. It's horrible except for all the others. Are we as bad as we seem to think we are because we're in the middle of it? And what would be some good reforms? I've talked in the past about perhaps eliminating automatic ballot access for the two political parties, opening it up to other parties with automatic ballot access. I don't know, but is there a picture starting to become clearer in your mind and your work that would be a good way forward to ensure our representative republic and the democracy that underpins it?
Well, I think there need to be a lot of fixes to the way elections are administered to make sure that it's secure and fair, and that everybody who's eligible gets to vote, but it's not easy to cheat. And Virginia has done a little bit on that, but it hasn't come anywhere close. I mean, to give you a quick example, we passed a voter ID law in this state, but it only applies to in-person voting. It doesn't apply to absentee ballots. And fraud, the easiest way to commit fraud is through absentee ballots. The state is part of what's called the Kansas Interstate Cross-Check Program. This is a program where we send our state voter registration list once a year to Kansas, along with about 29 other states. They compare the lists, and Virginia gets back this big list of all the people who are registered to vote in Virginia but are also registered in other states. However, ever since Terry McAuliffe got into office, and now with the new governor,
Ralph Northam,
they don't do anything with that data. Can you imagine that? So none of the counties in the state are being allowed to actually investigate and contact people who they know are registered in other states to make sure that they're not voting in both states. We're just neglecting that. And it's things like that that could easily be fixed and solved, but we're not doing it.
Well, a friend of ours commented back when Bob McDonnell was governor, when they were actually, and all they were doing was sending a letter saying, hey, we just noticed that you may be registered in 2 states. Can you let us know if Virginia is your state? And if not, you may need to contact a previous state you lived in. Not even accusatorily, but she received a letter on a vacant piece of property that had never had a building on it, yet it was apparently on the voter rolls as somebody's residence for their voting purposes. And then on top of that, we see the fraud that went on in Harrisonburg, where the young man, at perhaps the behest of his professor, was signing up dead people and then trying to get them to vote absentee. And it wasn't except for the fact that a judge knew one of the decedents was no longer able to be in a voting place, that it was caught. And how many of those go uncaught because of just that rare happenstance?
Yeah, or another quick one. I know for a fact that folks get called for jury duty in the county courts all the time who are excused from jury duty because it turns out that they've either moved out of state or they're not a U.S. citizen. That data from the courts does not get sent to election officials so they can take those people off the voter rolls, and they don't get sent again to the Commonwealth's attorneys in each county so they can investigate to see, well, if a non-citizen was on the voter rolls and got therefore called for jury duty, they may have broken the state law against non-citizens not registering or voting.
Actually, I believe Delegate Rob Bell had tried and failed to get that bill put forth that would have that information shared. One wonders, and because Madison spent a good deal of time studying the collapsed historical democracies before writing the Constitution up and trying to come up with a way that a democracy would survive itself, I guess is the best way to put it. One of the things he discovered, as many of the Enlightenment professors and investigators did, is that self-interest becomes the bane of a democracy, as the vote becomes currency. Is that where we're heading right now, Hans? Is that votes are so important to an elected official for power, but also financial gain, that our vote becomes their currency, and manipulating our vote for them becomes more important than it really should have in the construct of this country? Am I going too deep on that? Because that's troubled me.
No, not at all. Because look, we like to think of ourselves as different from the Europeans these days, but we are, in many ways, we've become a socialist country. No, not as bad as Germany and France, but when you look at the federal government programs and the accompanying state programs and the amount of benefits that are paid out to individual Americans all over the country through Medicaid, Medicare, all kinds of welfare services, etc., votes become extremely valuable because those votes have a big say-so over the money that people can vote that they're going to get.
Hans von Spakovsky, Election Law Reform Initiative at the Heritage Foundation. Two things that come up frequently. redistricting. Of course, we've had cases. Supreme Court's hearing a case out of Maryland. Pennsylvania's in a case. Virginia, we have our friends at One Virginia 2021 talking about nonpartisan redistricting reform, which unfortunately involves partisans appointing the supposed nonpartisans to come up with a redistricting. But aside from redistricting, I can't believe I'm saying this, but many years ago, Larry Sabato wrote a book in which one of the things he proposed in his, quote, new constitution was a primary system that divided the country into quadrants, and each quadrant all voted on the same day to avoid sort of this shenanigans that go around with some of the primary process, saying, all the Northeast votes on this day, and you have 2-3 months to campaign before it, and then everybody in that area votes once, and then the next quadrant. Are either of the, talk about the redistricting reform certainly is something we see a lot, is how we gerrymander, or is gerrymandering just a myth made up from people who haven't won any elections in a while? And talk about maybe structuring how our elections are done to limit the amount of time somebody can play funny business with the vote.
Well, the big fight that's going on over redistricting right now is the fact that, look, it is unconstitutional if you draw up districts that have wildly different populations, or if you draw up districts based entirely on race, then you're violating the Voting Rights Act. But there's 2 cases now before the Supreme Court in which the plaintiffs in the cases are claiming that if you engage in partisan redistricting, you draw up districts to favor Democrats or you draw up districts to favor Republicans, that is unconstitutional. Now, that I think is absurd. That idea. It's not that we don't have complaints about gerrymandering and the political parties, drawing up districts to favor one another. But the idea that that's unconstitutional, I think, is quite a stretch. Yeah. And while we can complain against our state legislature when they draw up districts that we think are too partisan, well, at least they're accountable to us. We can try to vote them out of office if we don't like what they've done. If the courts start taking over, doing all the redistricting, particularly on the federal level, then they have no accountability. You can't vote a federal judge out of office if you think that that particular judge is being too partisan. So the courts are not the way to solve this redistricting problem. If you don't like gerrymandering, you think it's too partisan, well then set up very limiting rules on what can be taken into account when the redistricting is done. For example, ban consideration of race, ban consideration of past voting patterns. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can do. Put in a rule that says you have to keep towns and cities and counties together as much as possible, so they don't get, torn into shreds because one part of a town may be Republican and another part Democrat. There are ways to do it without getting the courts deeper involved, and I'm hopeful that the Supreme Court is going to reject those 2 cases that it has before it and say, no, while we don't like too much partisanship, it's not unconstitutional.
What about the idea of the way we hold our elections and the amount of time involved and I guess maybe it's the human inclination. The more time you have, the more phony baloney, plastic banana, good time Charlie stuff you can get involved in, shortening the windows around some of these elections where the campaigning can go on. Is there, I can't imagine a constitutional prohibition on campaigning or one that would survive constitutional scrutiny, but is it something states maybe you could look at?
Well, I guess states could. I just don't know whether practically there's anything they could do to for example, stop the long lead time that candidates might take. I mean, to give you a quick example, if we did what Larry Sabato said, and I have a lot of respect for him, and you set up a regional primary date, so everybody in the Northeast would, in all those states, would vote on one particular date, how is that going to prevent various presidential candidates from saying, oh, well, we got to start our campaigning there, not 3 months, maybe 6 months, a year ahead of time? How is that going to prevent candidates from getting into those kind of elections as early as they think is needed to be able to win that big primary.
Well, and you raise a great point, because I can find 6 or 7 people who, though they are not saying they're running for president, certainly like a Cory Booker, every time I hear him, he sounds more and more like he's laying the groundwork for 2020, though there's no official campaign for 2020 going on. So I was just on Face the Nation. I don't know what you mean about campaign rhetoric or anything like that. So I guess there are certainly no great way to track it. Hans, thank you so much for everything that you've shared with us. The bigger question is, how do I get some people to vote for school boards? And maybe that's a much more challenging issue than federal elections. But we do appreciate your time this weekend, and thank you so much for everything you do at the Heritage Foundation.
Well, it was great talking to you as always. Bye-bye.
Coming up next, talking about somebody who does something great for us all, the owner of Silverback Distillery, Denver Riggleman, and former gubernatorial candidate, and I guess still has a lot of his whiskey rebellion stuff floating around out there. We're going to talk a little bit about Virginia ABC and First Amendment violations there, coming up next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine presented by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Our next guest sits there every day wondering, how is it the moonshine makers get a cable TV show? And it's almost like a Foster Brooks at one of those Dean Martin, never got a TV show. Denver Riggleman, owner of Silverback Distillery, makes it the old-fashioned way, legally, and of course, ran for governor, and one of the great campaign handles, and I hope he resuscitates it at some point, the Whiskey Rebellion, as it were. But it's good to hear from you, Denver. How are you doing as spring dawns across central Virginia?
Joe, we are doing great. The smell of rye whiskey is floating through the air on this beautiful spring morning in our distillery. So I don't know if it can get any better than that. SBDistillery.com if you want to see a little bit more about Silverback Distillery. And if you're ever in the Nelson County area, drive past a couple of communes and find the distillery in their midst. In there, no tofu as far as I know, but anyway, but it's organic anyway. Hey, Denver, I wanted to talk to you. Many years ago, bless his little old heart, Bob McDonnell, maybe didn't do as many things as he set out to do, but one of the things he did is he certainly exploded a blue dye bag on the statists in Richmond when he said, "Hey, listen, let's get out of the ABC business. Let's get out of this. Let's let the private industry manage their business, and let's just get out and we'll just collect tax revenue like most of the other adult states in the union." And he faced this amazing cabal of Republicans who presumed we'd just all be drunk in the streets if the government didn't sell the liquor. And, of course, the Democrats who thought they would give up tax money for it, and they could never do that. It's like asking a drunk to give up his alcohol. But as we continue on the road now, the ABC continues to be more and more abusive. And it's perhaps, in my travels, one of the more restrictive alcoholic overseeing government agencies I've ever come across. And I grew up in New York City, Denver, and I think that Virginia's ABC is out of control. Never mind what their police do with arresting teenage girls for buying seltzer water. But talk about this free speech issue that's come up, Jeff Tracy's suit regarding happy hours and what you can say and what you can't say about a happy hour. Well, I mean, that's part of the, you said New York. I didn't, Joe, Silverback's expanding into Pennsylvania and New York because actually the taxes are so much better in New York and Pennsylvania, and the liquor laws are so much looser. It's actually free. I know that sounds crazy in New York and Pennsylvania, but I just wanted to say that real quick when I talked about Jeff's lawsuit.
Well, you've got a lot of folks who just sat there and said, "Hold it, the taxes on anything are lower in New York or Pennsylvania." That's amazing to them, but yeah, in this case, it is.
Well, I would make I would say on my revenue this year, so say I did $1 million in gross. Say I sold $500,000 in bottles this year, right, out of my distillery.
Okay.
Which I did. Profit transfer. My profit transfer to Virginia ABC was $250,000, $250,000
Whoa.
on $500,000 in bottle sales. And New York, I hope you're sitting down for this. In New York, that would have been about 60,000. So
wow.
That's the difference. This year alone, just in one store, I'd have made another 200,000 just on bottle sales. That's nothing else. There's so many other limitations in Virginia. The ABC is a cabal, and it's in the guise of tax money. But you know what? If we got rid of it, the manufacturing and alcohol industry would explode in Virginia as far as distillation. People know that, and that's why you have lobbyists that are trying to stop us for the beer and wine lobbies. That's really what's going on there. But on the other side with Jeff, what a pair of stones on this guy to go after another ridiculous, inane, bureaucratically written, special interest beholden crap show of a law, which is the fact about the happy hour and the use of that. It just seems like the ABC is so lacking any common sense and so in the pockets, and the legislators that control them so in the pockets of special interest. You get to the point that when you have a system that corrupt, I think at some point people like Jeff, people like me, people like Scott Harris at Catoctin, we have these people that are standing up and saying, this is enough. We have jumped the shark and stupid, and ABC is the definition of that.
Well, and I think most people would sit there and I know I was when I first moved to the Commonwealth, and I said, hold it, the government owns the liquor stores. And I lived in Pennsylvania where certainly there you've got the Amish and you've got the Quakers, and you certainly would see a much more prurient past that would lead to such a thing. But even they don't control the liquor stores as tightly as Virginia does. It is as if Virginia wants to get its own little iron curtain on regarding owning an entire industry. And it's crazy to me to think that they would do it. And I agreed with Bob McDonnell wholeheartedly to it. And it was fascinating to watch this cabal. You talk about a business cabal, this cabal of left and right all teaming up against McDonnell's idea of getting out of the ABC business.
Well, I feel like they twiddle their fingers in the back rooms, sipping on illicit liquor, giggling at the straits that they put the alcohol industry in Virginia. And then they come out with these, we've grown another 20% this year. Yeah, I guess, what was it, 1984, ignorance is strength, all the things that were completely opposite. It's almost like theft is profit in the state of Virginia and the Commonwealth. And I think when you look at our love affair with monopolies, whether it's ABC or whether it's Dominion, there's a real sick issue for centralized government in Virginia, and as the first colony, I think that's why you see this liberty movement, people like Jeff that are coming out and gaining steam. Like we are on the verge of a collapse in some industries. As you see, there's breweries closing now. 4 distilleries have closed this year. The distillery industry, they keep saying, well, it's growing. Well, that's because of the $60+ million that distillers have pumped into distilleries and trying to get things started in this state. In Kentucky, the whiskey industry there, I think, is what? Gosh, I wish I had the exact number. I don't want to misstate, but it's in the billions, right? Here, the distillery industry is $200 million. We have just as good a climate, if not a better climate for whiskey. We have all these amazing advantages. We're in an area where we get to suck federal dollars. We're like a leech on the federal system coming into Northern Virginia. So we have all this free money that's floating around, and they use that as a crutch. And instead of allowing industry to thrive, they constrict it based on special interest monies. And that's why I am considering a lawsuit very soon. I'm already talking to one of your favorite people, Joe. John Adams. I talked to him about how do I sue ABC, and I got to tell you, I probably have to go in alone and unafraid because ABC controls everything I do as a distillery. So isn't that going to be a war? I think Jeff has set the standard that I think through legislation is probably the only way to be able to do this.
Well, you break my heart because you've just made me kind of fancifully wander off into a world where Denver Riggleman was governor and John Adams was attorney general. So I'm sorry, I have to recollect myself now, Denver. So many of our laws predate the U.S. Constitution because they're, British common law for the most part, and laws of the Admiralty and things like that we really need to have a binge and purge. The amazing thing is we actually wrote a new Constitution within your lifetime and mine, and just for the most part, left most of the stuff that was there in the first place, just kind of cleaned up some of the racial issues. But that we rely on the law of the seas, the British Admiralty, some of the British common law still rules us, and we really need to go through the Virginia rolls and purge them, because being the home to Jefferson and Madison and Patrick Henry and George Mason, you'd think we'd have been this uber libertarian paradise, and I think it is quite honestly more restrictive of a state to live in than anything outside of Massachusetts, maybe.
Well, we become Virginia-chusetts. It's so funny you said Massachusetts. I told somebody we're the Massachusetts of the state.
It's true, though.
So, I mean, as far as 2021, I'm going to run for governor again regardless, just because it's my home state. I was born and bred here. But I feel like you see some Liberty candidates starting to bubble up, like the Nick Freitas's, like the Ben Kleins. I think you have some people out there who've had it. I hope that they continue to run, and I hope we start to get this sort of compelling type of candidates that are out there. They're saying liberty over this ridiculousness called the Virginia control state. And when I say control state, it's not just ABC. I think it's Dominion. I think it's what you said when it talks to civil asset forfeiture. It is ridiculous in this Commonwealth. And you're right. I almost feel like we do need a purge, and that purge can only come from the people wanting something that's a little better than what we have right now, which is let people be what they want to be. Let's stop controlling every aspect of our life, and let's stop taxing manufacturing to death. And I think whether it's B-poll or whether it's tax programs, Joe, gosh, go Virginia with regional oligarchs handing out $24.5 million. We have a state that's just reeling from centralized stupidity. Some people are starting to see that, and hopefully there's a change in the air.
Well, I think so, too. I was talking to a fellow who I was one of about 30 people that voted for Congress back in 2010, Ron Farron, who's an insurance adjuster, and he was telling me that, you can become an insurance investigator without a license, but you need a license to become a hair salon operator and to do hair. And that's a crazy place we've gone.
It's crazy. Occupational licensing in Virginia, which is, again, a special interest thing to make sure some people can actually make money and others can't.
Yeah, you talk about certificates of need and things like that, Denver, where it just begs for the cronyism. I've got a friend in Richmond, and they only meet 2 or 3 months out of the year, but they certainly do get a lot done out of that. And maybe it's because they leave for the other 9 months out of the year. The General Assembly leaves Richmond to the regulatory state, to our own little Virginia swampland there. And I guess there's a metaphor to Jamestown kind of being a swampy, boggy area in the first place. Born and raised in a socialist idea, and thank goodness we survived it. Only until somebody said, what if we get to keep what we farm and sell it to each other? Then we managed to make it through Denver. So do you think there's going to be a case, because, unfortunately we're talking about appointees, judges that are appointed and then they're beholden to. Do you think this ABC case has any legs?
I think it does. And I think you're right, though. Gosh, Joe, nobody likes conspiracy theories. What is that saying? Never ascribe to a conspiracy, which you can ascribe to stupidity, right? But I got to tell you, as far as judges are concerned and this lawsuit itself, I'm confident that we're going to win the policy war, like I did in my legislation this year. We got through all the policy, got through even Senate Finance, but House Appropriations. And I'm going to mention some people here. Namely Barry Knight, right? When you get into appropriations, they're so in the pockets that they do things that are so against what liberty is, and they make up obtuse reasons, talking points given to them by lobbyists. You might have that same issue here. We might win the policy fight, but we might get to the point where they keep kicking the can down the road on free speech based on the fact that ABC and the legislators that are in the pockets of all these people have so much power. And, you got the restaurant lobbies, you got the wine lobbies, wine distributors, you got the beer manufacturers lobbies. Joe, all these lobbies are pumping millions. This is $1 billion. This is family money type of stuff. Mm-hmm. And we, Liberty people, are getting in the way of statist type of things, and it makes us a target. So Jeff has just made himself a target by doing the right thing. And we get no prizes for being right. Usually when you're right in a centralized economy, you get frickin' purged, right?
So, you find out what right means.
Fear is Liberty people. Are we going to get purged? Are we going to get by the judges even when we're right? When we're right on every level. And when I sue ABC, Joe, it's going to be much more. You're talking about antitrust. And I think that's what I need to do, and that's what I'm trying to figure out through due diligence is even afford a lawsuit against a government with unlimited resources, and would anybody join me? And I don't know if that's the fact because of fear.
Well, but there's also an important part to that because that fight has to be brought. And what's amazing to me is this isn't a bipartisan issue. I will listen to my friends from the left jump up and down and scream and yell about Dominion and how much money they give to the General Assembly for that Dominion and Appalachian Power Protection Act that would allow them just to keep their money without any rigor. And then you point out other instances where big hospital concerns have paid money to those who are like Emmett Hanger flogging the idea of Medicaid expansion, like, well, that's different. That's health care, and we got to take care of the people who can't take care of themselves. And it's amazing the multifacetedness. Because I say that, Denver, because I just don't think two faces are enough for these people.
No, I mean, well, of course it's enough, Joe. I mean, Joe, if you pay me, say $290,000 over an election cycle, I mean, I'm going to give you an opinion whatever you want, right?
Yeah.
That's what these people do. So I think they have like 7 faces. I think their backside is the biggest face that they do to the public.
Their backside.
So I think that's probably what you're looking at as you're talking to the rear part. That's the only thing they're using. And I don't think if they remove their heads from their point of contact, start thinking about what we are as actually with the people, for the people, I think we've got to have some type of political revolution in the Commonwealth. And I think it's a liberty revolution. I don't think it's left or right. I think we got some, how I feel about progressives. I think they're probably, a human stain on mankind. But I think the far, far right, if you're talking about tiki torch, losers in khakis, I think they're a human stain. So there's a liberty group that has to come out and say, we've had enough.
Yeah.
And it has to be awful, and it has to be directed. It has to be pointed. It has to be with class. It has to be all that and all that above. And, Joe, I don't think if we do that, I don't think if we go against people like Ed Hanger, right, Chris Jones, Barry Knight, all these people that are saying that they're Republicans, or all these people that saying that they're liberty, I think that's enough. That's frickin' enough. And we're going to fight, and we could lose. And that's the scary part about this, Joe, is that anybody who goes into this battle, I've lost for 4 years. I've had my ass handed to me over and over again by lobbyists and by people laughing at me. But you got to go back in. You got to fight because we're Americans, we're Virginians, and I think at some point we got to rise up and say that's enough.
Well, Denver, and we're visiting Denver Riggleman, owner of Silverback Distillery, sbdistillery.com. Where can people find out more about helping you out in this movement in the Whiskey Rebellion? You still keep that Facebook page up?
Oh, yeah, I do. We got the Whiskey Rebellion Facebook page. We still got the Denver for Governor page up. I still got almost 4,000 followers. I don't know what the heck I'm doing, Joe, for people to give a rat's about what I'm doing. I'm running for office right now. But we got that up, and our distillery, I still consult for the Office of Secretary of Defense for electronic warfare and countermeasures.
Oh, so you go into the swamp every now and then.
Well, I'm there 3 days a week in the Pentagon, and I have to tell you, there's still some good people up there. And when you're still, supporting your country, supporting what you're doing, I think at some point you're like, I still got the fighting spirit. I'm 48 now, Joe, but every now and then, what did Toby Keith say? I'm not as good as I once was, but I'm as good once as I ever was.
Well, Denver, it reminds me, and over the Easter weekend, I changed my Facebook profile banner to a painting, and I got a lot of people say, what is this a painting of? What is it? And it's a depiction of Jesus driving the money changers from the temple. And it's a reminder, that Moses creates a great church that frees the slaves, but then by the time Jesus comes along, that's been corrupted. Then Peter creates a church in Jesus' name, and by the time Martin Luther comes along, it's been corrupted. So, there can be depressions in the fact that we've corrupted ourselves in what Jefferson and Madison and Patrick Henry created, but we got to drive the money changers from the temple.
We do, and I think it's almost like the Liberty people have to drive the lobbyists.
Yeah.
From the GAB. So
yeah,
I feel like we need to whip them out of there, and I think that's the war that we have in front of us, Joe. Man, you're doing God's work and what you're trying to do to get the message out there, and I appreciate it so much. But I think you're going to see one-offs. You're going to see this little bubbling like Jeff, like me, like the Nick Freitas's, that are running for Senate that have a different message than you've heard in Virginia in a long while. I think you're going to see that. And I think and I hope, even though we could lose, even though we could rush headlong in the battle, and then I'm like William Wallace or we're like Mel Gibson, getting eviscerated, immolated, up there and screaming freedom. We have to take that risk and that chance, and we have to do this. And I'm going to continue to do it. And, Joe, you've been doing it for so long that I know it gets frustrating for you, but I appreciate all you do.
It gets me up every morning. Keeps me out of the house, as my wife says. But, William Wallace's sacrifice brought a big status like Robert the Bruce down from the castle and won him over. So hopefully there's some guys who are on the fence saying, yeah, this isn't what I thought it was, and maybe I should join that movement and be that movement, like a Ben Klein who's been around it for a very long time, but is certainly realizing that that the Virginia way isn't as sanctified as they made it out to be. God bless you, sir, and have a wonderful next couple of weeks, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Joe, God bless. And again, thank you for everything you're doing too, buddy, okay? I don't think people thank you enough. I appreciate it. That's all right.
And all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, until next week's Freedom and Prosperity Radio, I'm Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.